From the library of the New York Stock Exchange at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets in New York City, you're inside the Ice House, our podcast from Intercontinental Exchange on markets, leadership, and vision in global business. The dream drivers that have made the NYSE an indispensable institution of global growth for over 225 years. Each week, we feature stories of those who hatch plans, create jobs, and harness the engine of capitalism. Right here, right now at the NYSE and at ICE's exchanges and clearinghouses around the world. And now welcome inside the Ice House. Here's your host, Josh King of Intercontinental Exchange.
Let me tell you about a 10-year love affair. Not with a person, but with a beverage. It was 2010. I was visiting a friend in Ventnor, New Jersey, just south of Atlantic City. The day was hot. I went out for a run on the beach. It left me wicked thirsty. Now, all through my life, I'd been a drinker of Coca-Cola. That's NYSE ticker symbol KO. When I wanted to drink more healthy, I reached for a Diet Coke. So when I came back to that house I was visiting, all sweaty and parched, my host handed me a can of seltzer. It wasn't a fancy brand, just that perfect combination of water and bubbles that got my mouth dancing. No guilt from calories or chemicals, as it staunched my thirst, and I've never looked back. Then I read a book, The Invention of Air by Stephen Johnson. It tells the story of Dr. Joseph Priestley, who lived from 1733 to 1804. And you may never have heard of Dr. Priestley, but when you breathe in oxygen, you're ingesting something he discovered. Back then, in one of his open source pamphlets, he called it dephlogisticated air. The guy did so many things in his life. He really was a revolutionary and a Renaissance man all rolled into one. And along the way, in 1767, he accidentally discovered carbonation as well, creating the first batch of seltzer by passing water back and forth over a steaming vat of beer. And 6 years later, he'd published the recipe for that too, calling it Directions for Impregnating Water with Fixed Air. Now, I highly recommend Johnson's book, but it tells, among other things, the story of an entrepreneurial failure, the failure of Dr. Priestley to successfully monetize his invention. But let me give you a hint of someone who has. 15 years ago at her home in San Francisco, Kara Goldin was wrestling with that same draw of sugary drinks that I faced and did something about it. Water with just a hint of fruity taste. That was the name, and it stuck. A carbonated version followed, and a line of sunscreen, too. And today, Kara's company makes $150 million annually, distributed in all 50 states within an incredible online sales business. And I'm one of her customers. You've got to be undaunted to grow a business from a home kitchen full of water-soaked fruit into a global enterprise grossing over $150 million. And that's the title of Kara's new book, Undaunted: Overcoming Doubts and Doubters, just out from HarperCollins. We've all been there. Undaunted shows you how to learn from failures and frustrations and how to move forward despite uncertainty and turn criticism into motivation. Our conversation with Kara Goldin is right after this.
Navigating dynamic markets requires a relentless pursuit of knowledge. Now, join market experts to learn with ICE Education Live. Attend live video training with practical lessons across global asset classes. On-demand modules provide base knowledge. Participants can then attend live training sessions, including group review and tests for certification. We also tailor training for your needs and in-house projects. ICE Education Live courses. Continue your education today.
On Twitter, check out @Kara Goldin and get treated to many daily doses of simple inspiration. I've been following her for years, and I know her story pretty well. The kid who grew up in Arizona, came east after college and started in media sales jobs at Time Inc. and CNN, then worked in e-commerce for an Apple spin-off startup, moving then on to AOL before deciding to step back and focus on her family. It was then that she, like Dr. Priestley, began experimenting in her home laboratory, her kitchen, and we'll let her pick up the story from there. Welcome, Kara, inside the Ice House.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So let's start with this sad roadblock put in the way by your husband, Theo. You sent him off to do some research, and he comes back with bad news. He says, Cara, there's no way to get the taste you want and still have enough shelf life to distribute this product around the country. There's a lot to unpack right there: manufacturing, taste, preservation, distribution. Take our listeners back to your kitchen in 2005.
I came up with this idea, and I'm taking some money out of our bank account, our personal bank account, which, is pretty scary when you're writing $50,000 checks, right, for bottles and caps, et cetera. And, we were really just trying to kind of get the flavor to be kind of where I wanted it to be, but also get the proper shelf life. And we just knew that we were, not going to be able to do this. And again, I talk about we because my husband ended up, really kind of feeling sorry for me because I was sort of going it alone, and he was curious about where I was going with this. And so at that point, he said exactly what you said. And I said, well, what can we do? And he looked at me and he said, well, we can have a short shelf life and just, create a product the best we can right now, and potentially, self-distribute our product as well and get it out there to people. And not really thinking that I would say, okay, fine, let's go do that. Being the person that I was, I always viewed the world as, okay, that we might not be able to do these things today, but let's dream of that. Let's set that as our goal, and let's just go try. That is really one of the biggest things that kind of gets in people's way, is that they think that they actually have to, wait to do something, or whether it's launch a new career or solve a problem or launch a product until they have all of the answers, until it's perfect.
We're going to roll through the story that you paint in Undaunted, Cara, throughout our conversation, but just to sort of set it up before we head back in time to Arizona, I get my hint at my bodega in New York City, but I also get it with a few clicks of my mouse, just so that people have a context of the person that they're talking to. Paint a picture of your company quickly today before we head back in time.
Well, we are in about 30,000 stores nationwide, available in Target, Costco, Kroger, lots of different stores, Whole Foods. But in addition, we sort of grew up in, tech companies, and they started setting up healthier and better for you things in like Google and Facebook, et cetera. And now we're in American Express and lots of other companies throughout, the country. And then in addition to that, my previous life was running e-commerce partnerships for AOL. And so we ended up setting up, primarily because consumers would say to us, we can't actually get your product in our local store or the flavor that we want. So we decided to start selling them, water online. And today that business is 55% of our overall business. It's, all of our flavors and everything we do is there. We're truly an omni-channel brand that, looks at the consumer as, having the choice of where they're ultimately going to buy it. And certainly during the pandemic, when many people weren't shopping at stores or not shopping at stores as much, having your own direct-to-consumer business where we can, connect with the consumer directly was super, super key. But we're the largest non-alcoholic beverage in the country that doesn't have a relationship with any of the soda companies. And again, always mission-based. I started this company before they called mission-based companies. Now that's sort of a popular term, I guess. But, it was, I think what's the most fun about our company is just, like I said, really having the consumer in mind and hearing from the consumer every single day that we're really, helping them get healthy, and that we, often are the first steps in them knowing that they can do it. And I think like that is something, that is just as a CEO, as a founder, I mean, to hear from consumers that you're, really helping them do something that they thought was impossible. I mean, just think about that for a second. Right now, we're supporting breast cancer awareness and research. And that really stemmed from the number of consumers who reached out to me over the years who shared that hint actually helped them mask the metallic taste that they get when they're going through chemo. That's incredibly powerful, right? And all that, every single email says actually two things: help and discover, which to me says that's a brand. There is a relationship with that. And I mean, I'm incredibly excited and proud about what we've done with this brand to really help people.
I mean, Cara, long before you learned all the things that you needed to learn and all the things that you didn't know, you were this young woman in Scottsdale, one of 5 kids. Your dad was on the road a lot. Your mom was working too. Not a lot of time to get a lot of direction from parents. Where did that leave you?
Well, I think also thinking, I had 2 brothers that were pretty wild who were ahead of me. So I think by the time my parents got to me, the 2 things that they would say to me is, don't get in trouble and don't embarrass us, right? Like that was those were the key moments, but very, created a very independent, actually all 5 of us, very, very independent, but also left room to kind of explore and just go try things. And so, people always say, did you always want to be an entrepreneur? No, I didn't know I wanted to be an entrepreneur, but I would do things that I just thought, were just super fun, right? Fun to me was such a key thing. But also, typically it would be making money along the way too. So, my first job was at a toy store. That job led into me actually being one of the buyers, along with the owner of the store. And, I credit that for learning a lot about profit and loss and, business plan. I was 14 years old. And I remember going home and saying to my dad, I'm helping with the, buying. And I mean, he was like, do they know that you're 14? And I was like, they never really asked.
Tell me a little bit more about your dad, the guy who questioned whether the toy store owner Nancy even knew you were 14 years old, because the way you write about him, I suppose it's the way a lot of kids look at their parents, especially their dads, maybe going back to Jimmy Stewart as George Bailey in Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life, the man who works so hard to provide for his family, who has to kind of squelch his own dreams. He was a ConAgra man, maybe the original man in the gray flannel suit.
Yeah. And he did have a gray flannel suit to some extent. And I think for him, he was, I think about him, he passed away just over 10 years ago. But I think about him as really being a frustrated entrepreneur. In many ways, this book is an apology to him, because I think I gave him a hard time over the years saying, you come up with all these ideas and you don't actually execute on them. And what I learned later was that, and this is something I share with entrepreneurs all the time when they say, should I just go do it? Should I go launch something? What I say is, I don't know what your situation is. So it's very difficult for me to actually tell you to go do something. For my dad, he had 5 kids. He had a steady income. I mean, back then, if people typically had the same job forever, right? Or maybe 2 jobs. But for him, he really was dedicated, and not just dedicated to his work, but also dedicated to his family, and wanted to make sure that we all went to college, and, and that was really what his focus was. But I think also he viewed, all of his kids as, go out and do whatever you want to do that ultimately makes you happy. He had founded a brand inside of ConAgra called Healthy Choice, which I still look at today as, one of the original brands and packages that were really talking about the story behind the brand and a lot of the sourcing. And, it's what he did every day. And I didn't have a full appreciation for it. Because again, when you're a kid, you just think like, oh, my dad just does this really annoying thing. And we have to eat, like we called them TV dinners back then. We're like, no more, don't bring this home anymore, but again, the fact that he created a brand that is still one of the top sellers for ConAgra today is pretty crazy.
I mean, talking about the story behind the brand, Cara, in a few weeks, we're having on this show Mark Salter, who's the author of The Luckiest Man, Life with John McCain. And mine is a family of Democrats, but when Senator McCain died, my son created a living memorial to him in our backyard because, he's so much bigger than his party affiliation. As a kid growing up in Arizona, you have your own McCain story about lessons he taught you.
Yeah, so I interned with him starting when I was in high school. And, it was I have many John McCain stories, but one of my favorite and first ones was when I ultimately got the internship there. And he was doing, the final round of internships. And he said, so why do you want to work here? He was actually in the House of Representatives at the time. And I said, okay, so here's the thing. My parents are Republican, but I'm not sure if I'm a Republican. And so I want to come and work for you because I want to know for sure. And he started laughing. So the running joke was, over the next 7 years, and I went to Arizona State University and ended up doing, some internshiping with him throughout college too. He'd walk by me in the office, not every time, but every once in a while. And especially when he was talking to somebody else, and he would point to me and he'd say, so have you figured it out yet? Are you a Republican yet? And I said, no, I'm still, even when I left, I said, I'm still trying to figure it out. And then, I worked for Obama on a project around entrepreneurship a few years back. I think like the one other thing that he said to me that still sticks with me, and I was very sad, watching the funeral as well, is that, I remember disagreeing with him on a few things, and including the fact that, Martin Luther King Day was not being recognized. And I said something to him, just a little bit out of turn, but I also, felt like I should exercise my voice a little bit, and I wanted to know why all the rest of the states were actually recognizing it, and Arizona was not recognizing it. And he said, you need to remember one thing. You need to remember that sometimes you will meet people and you will engage with people, and you're going to agree. You need to agree to disagree. And so I said, okay, well, I do disagree. And what was so great is, I think it was 2012, he finally said that was a decision that he made poorly, and it was not the right decision. And so I do believe that it was the right thing to do to bring it up with him. Clearly, he had friends that were not Republicans, right?
Yeah, sure.
And very close friends.
Over the 200 or so episodes of this show, Cara, one of our favorites was back, I think, on episode 34 with Derek Mock, who's a senior brand director with Anheuser-Busch InBev. That's NYSE ticker symbol BUD, B-U-D, who stopped by to break down the newest addition to the company's reserve collection, Freedom Reserve Bud Lager. Cara, tell us about how learning about selling beer launched your own career in marketing.
I was waitressing also when I was in college at a local Mexican restaurant that's still in Phoenix, one of my favorites, called Teepee. And I was about to graduate, and I kept seeing this guy who came in often. One day he struck up a conversation with me, and he said, so what are you majoring in? What are you going to do after graduation? And I said, I'm really not sure. I mean, this is what my major is. And I said, what do you do? Right. And he said, oh, well, I work for Anheuser-Busch. And I said, oh, like, what do you do for Anheuser-Busch? And he said, well, we film a lot of movies and commercials in Arizona. And so I actually do product placement on, the sets. I'm like,
wow.
Wait, what? Like you put beer on a set? And I was like, how do I get that job? And he said, well, he was like, if you really want to interview for it, I can probably get you an interview. And I'm like, yeah, of course I want to interview for a beer job, like on a set. And, I was half kidding, but half serious. And I think that was like the first moment that I really thought, gosh, I'm like going to school. Like nobody talks about, product placement on sets. I had no idea. Had you ever heard about that job in college? I mean, I thought, I don't know, that seems like a pretty good job. Right. And so that was like the moment when I had to go to LA to go and interview. And I thought, gosh, if I'm going to LA just to kind of make my time and my money, go a little bit further, justify it, I should go and see what else is out there that I really want to, go do. And so that led actually to a series of job interviews over the next 30 days that I had over 90 job interviews in a time that everybody, I guess, like I just didn't get the memo that it was a really tough time to go and find a job. And, my husband, who I met when I finally landed in New York, had gone to Amherst College, like great school and on many, many levels, very difficult school. But, he sort of had gotten the memo that like it was a very tough year to get a job. And he did end up getting a job, but he was like, how in the world did you get a job at Time magazine? And you went and had all these job offers. I had over 60 job offers, like out of 90, because I would just like show up in these offices and, people would introduce me to people. They would hear like, oh, you're going to Chicago. You should meet my friend, who is at XYZ or whatever. And that's what I realized.
And this is done all in the era before LinkedIn and Facebook. This is just you personal networking.
And I would send an email. We had like the Macintosh was out. I had a Mac. I was just starting to do this and send letters, et cetera. But I think for me, it was. It was just, again, a story of trying. I mean, it was crazy. I interviewed at McKinsey. I didn't even know what a consulting agency was. I had, interviewed, like I said, at Anheuser-Busch for different things. And then I finally, landed in New York and was really going for my dream job, which was being in journalism at Fortune magazine. But they weren't going to hire me with no experience. And so, I ended up like getting a job in circulation at Time magazine. And again, it wasn't like, as I say, one step above the mailroom. Maybe it was two steps above the mailroom, but I think it's getting your foot in the door.
I mean, the way you write about it, and you started with this walk into Marshall Loeb's office at Fortune. We've had Alan Murray, the current CEO of Fortune, on this show. But when you finally get to Time, it doesn't sound like it was that easy. The woman you worked for needed help. And reflecting on how you managed through that situation, I think you wrote in your book, I still tell new recruits at Hint that the number one thing they need to do is make sure their boss and their team are successful. My old boss at First Data, Frank Bisignano, told me something similar. Why is that such an important lesson?
I think so often, you get a job, right? Like and there's this huge excitement because you think like, okay, I'm going to go in and this is what my role is. But at the end of the day, your role will ultimately be much more visible if the people above you that are surrounding you are more successful, because so many people don't think about a role that way, right? They instead think about themselves and how they're doing and will they, get a new title in a year and more money. Like, I believe that if you actually focus on making sure that your boss is successful and that the company is successful, that stuff will come. If you are leading by making sure that the people around you are successful and helping where you can, I think that is also what you will be remembered for. And, even along the way, I mean, I remember with Time, for example, there were people who did not work in my group. I mean, Michael Loeb, who was Marshall Loeb's son, he was very good friends with my boss. And he used to come and check on my boss, and her husband had passed away, and he was a good friend of Michael's. And that's how I met him. And I remember, Michael just saw that every single day I just was really focusing on making sure that Brooke really had what she needed. And after a year of being there, he came to me and he said, I need an assistant. I need some other people, because he saw what I was doing. And years later, when I was in a very different role at AOL, and he was still at Time, and when Time and CNN and all my former companies were coming together, he picked up the phone and called me and said, I know you understand all of these different people and the different cultures you have. I want you to talk to me about this stuff. And again, this is somebody that I think, just because I really focused on people around me and EQ and all that kind of stuff as well, it was, somebody that years later that you just really relied on.
I'm just on company culture for a minute, Cara. Your next stop was at CNN, a brand that I've come to know very well through my years in politics, and have many friends who spent a lot of time there in different parts of the business side, editorial side. But it's an asset that has tended to shift a lot through different leaders and different owners. I mean, you mentioned that it passed eventually to AOL. What about the culture there at CNN taught you about the culture that you'd want to create when you started your own company?
The concept that I first learned at CNN was speed of getting things done. You just didn't see people, spending a lot of time sitting in meetings, and I think that today, that something I'm really, really feel fortunate that I was able to see was all these different cultures. And so when I ultimately started my own company, being able to bring a little bit of all of these into ours. And, still to this day, my biggest frustration is when I see, that we've gotten to a point on a decision where it's just we're just sitting in meetings all day. I'm like, no more meetings. We need to just make decisions, and they might not be the right decision, but we need to just go and make a decision. And I think a lot of that comes from some of the stuff that I learned at CNN.
You write in different parts of your book about your own lifelong love affair with the Wall Street Journal, and I've had my own as well, and loved the years I think that you might have when Walt Mossberg was writing all about personal tech. Reading how Walt helped you figure out the nerve to make cold calls. Tell me how that all coalesced when you made the move to the Bay Area, and the importance of gumption, just to pick up the phone and show up at someone's door.
Yeah, I mean, I had just moved from New York to the Bay Area with my soon-to-be husband, and I wasn't planning on actually finding a job. I had just left CNN. I really wanted to plan my wedding and take some time off. But I loved the Wall Street Journal, and I opened up my Wall Street Journal over a cup of coffee and was reading an article about this little CD-ROM company that was doing shopping on a CD-ROM. And I'd had some friends in New York who had worked on some different shopping internet companies, mostly the cable companies like Verizon, Viacom, and Pac Bell, and some others were doing some testing in it, but nothing was really getting anywhere. And I thought what was really intriguing about this article was they were talking about this guy who had been at Apple, and I had followed Steve Jobs, and he had this idea that if you stuck all of the content onto a disk and just told the consumer to stick the disk in, then, basically they would think that the internet was working, right? And you just keep telling them to update it. And I was like, wow, that, I mean, that is so big, right? And so, I wasn't doing anything anyway. And this And, these three guys who worked at Apple spun it out into this company. It was called En Passant inside of Apple. And then they spun it out into this company called To Market. And I'd seen that the company was based in San Mateo. And I kind of remembered that San Mateo was sort of by San Francisco, but I didn't really, I had a car. So I figured, what the heck? So I called this guy up and I said, hey, I just read this article, in the Wall Street Journal. And I think it's just really interesting what you're doing. Can I take you to, lunch, coffee? And I said, I don't want a job. I'm just like really intrigued. I'm sort of like just trying to get some research about what I want to do next. I'd been at CNN. I'd, seen some different models. And when I went down to grab lunch with them, explained the whole company. And I remember like the one thing that everybody cared about at both CNN and Time was actually making money. So I kept asking like, but how do you make money? Like, it all sounds great and pretty and works fast and everything, but how do you make money? And they were like, oh, well, we haven't really figured that part out yet. And so that's when I just decided that, basically this company was not very interesting because they weren't focused on money. I just couldn't like put two and two together to know how it was going to be successful. And then one of the guys reached out to me and he said, I know you're not looking for a job, but would you be interested in, maybe coming and joining us? And I'm like, what would I do? And he was like, you would like call on all these retailers and you would get them to actually pay us money. Because we realized after this meeting that, maybe we just don't really understand it. I'll never forget, like they sent me a employment letter and said, okay, here's your offer. And it was pretty long and my husband's new lawyer. And I said, can you read this? And so he read it and he's like, wait, they're giving you equity in like the company? And I said, like, what's that? What is equity? I joined him and I just thought it was interesting that, here I was going out and calling on like, Mickey Drexler at the Gap, who I had friends who were working there. And I'd say, yeah, I was in Mickey's office and I was talking to him about, what we're doing. And they're like, wait, how in the world did you get a meeting with Mickey? And, Mickey is one of many where what I learned is like, this was innovation, right? This was like a whole new thing. They were retailers that were trying to figure out, should they be on the internet? Shouldn't they be on the internet? And so here I was like really explaining, the internet to them as well as this disk and why, graphics won't load so quickly. And I loved what we were doing. And then after 6 months, AOL, who was one of our investors, came and acquired us and basically acquired us for, not only the product, but also the relationships that we had, that I had built with a lot of these retailers. And so that just continued to really, just become more.
And I assume that the equity appreciated a little bit.
By the time they split it, it was like, less than a penny, if that's possible. It was pretty crazy. But I think like that's another thing that, really I brought to Hint. It was not very common 15 years ago. And, there's still many companies today in the beverage space that actually don't give their employees equity. And every single one of our employees has equity. That's just really something that I think, just helps us also to retain. We have employees, of the 200 employees, we have employees that have been here, for over 10 years. And again, like it's because they really have skin in the game.
When we come back, we get a hint of what's in Kara Goldin's future as she mixes up her first batch of her potion in her kitchen. More with the author of Undaunted, Overcoming Doubts and Doubters, right after this.
In our time of greatest need, we want to thank the true heroes around the world for stepping up, for taking care of us, and keeping us safe. With your expertise, your commitment, your sacrifice, and your selflessness, we'll work together to create a brighter future. And we thank you for reminding us what really matters. From all of us, Thank you.
Welcome back. Before the break, Kara Goldin, the CEO of Hint and the author of Undaunted, Overcoming Doubts and Doubters, and I were talking about growing up in the desert Southwest and making her mark here in New York City before heading west again as part of the e-commerce gold rush. Thinking back to the stories you told about your dad, there's so many dreams that people have that even they resist telling their spouses about. And you didn't even tell Theo, your husband, who was the CEO of a company called Z Medics, the extent of your thinking as you're working in the kitchen. He thought you were just having fun screwing around, as he put it. What was actually going on in the kitchen? And, what is it about dynamics between spouses that eventually, you had to come clean and eventually he becomes your partner?
I think for me, I felt like I needed to talk to him about it when I was actually, like taking big checks, writing big checks out of our personal bank account, joint bank account thing. Like I felt like, and I also didn't want him to think that I was like, having a big party in Jamaica with my girlfriends or something with the $50,000. I was like, oh, by the way, so I've got this idea. One of the things I write about in my book, and really the subtitle is Overcoming Doubts and Doubters. When you ask your spouse or your friends about, like you already have your own doubts, and then you're basically saying, okay, I'm going to start this company. I don't know if it's going to work or not. Like, of course they're going to doubt you, right? They're going to say, that's a bad idea. You have no experience. Like the big soda companies are going to kill you and whatever. And so I think that's where I was at. Like, I just thought maybe I need to just prove this out a little bit more and write a business plan and actually think about it. I mean, I started Hint with 4 kids under the age of 6. I had the day I was having, my 4th child was the day that I actually put the first bottle on the shelf at Whole Foods. I mean, it's like, there were a lot of reasons why I should have been daunted, right? By, not being able to start this company. But I think for me, what I always share with people that I've done, over the years, when things are hard, I kind of, break them into parts, right? And actually think, okay, well, I'm not going to worry about, the fact that everybody thinks with 4 kids, I'm not going to be able to do this. Instead, I'm going to figure out, okay, how do I get it on the shelf at Whole Foods? I'm going to get in my car and I'm going to go and talk to the guy at Whole Foods and then see what happens. And then I would celebrate that win. I feel like now when I run into hard times, I remind myself very naturally about the things that I thought were never supposed to happen that I've been able to accomplish. And, and I think most successful people will actually say the same thing, that the more hard things that you've done, that you've actually been able to achieve. Now I sit here and, when people are doubting me, I think, well, I don't know. I've kind of done some pretty big things, right? And I think that's something that people really need to get in the habit of. Challenge yourself, right? And challenge sort of your mindset as well, because if you do, you're going to have some failures along the way, but you're also going to have some successes, and they could be as big as Hint.
I'm curious what you might think about how 2020 is different from 2005 or the few early years of Hint. We've all read the news a few years ago when Amazon bought Whole Foods, and those of us who've wrestled with the conundrum that is fulfillment by Amazon know how daunting it can be to work with that company in some ways. How can the next Kara Goldin, looking at the next Hint, be minted in an age when there are no more Woodlands Whole Food markets where the local manager like Glenn Del Porto can take a risk on a homemade fruit water?
Well, I think, first of all, I don't believe that grocery stores are going away. I think that they are staying. I still get great pleasure, and Glenn is actually sadly not at my local Woodlands market anymore, but I still get great pleasure in going in and shopping in a very nice grocery store. And I think Whole Foods, being acquired by Amazon, it has changed. And it's become, more mass. I think they try every day not to, change, but I think there are some aspects that have clearly changed. But I think for us, what Amazon did was really show us that consumers have an appetite for having deliveries directly to their home. I mean, I think during 2020, kind of the company that has clearly showed up, they were already here, but they've showed up, in spades in 2020 is Instacart. I mean, the way that people shop, during a pandemic in stores is Instacart. And I was working I took on a route through, the pandemic to help my sales team out. And, I told my sales team that everybody, I would say 95% of the people that were at the cash register were Instacart workers. And so I think that grocery stores will remain, but it will be different. And certainly, while Amazon, we love Amazon and they were awesome, for so many people during the pandemic. If you were not an essential product like Hint, getting the product from Amazon took a lot longer. So you'll still go to a grocery store. But I think that, if you're a company today and you're interested in actually getting on the shelf, and frankly, this is sort of a conversation I think for retailers as well. I feel like if you're a product that is kind of being forced to buy shelf space, or let's say you're a pack of gum, for example, those impulse buys at the cash register, I just think shouldn't you actually be figuring out how to advertise on a service like a Instacart or, I don't know, whatever it is, the equivalent of that goes in and does your shopping for you. So when the consumer's trying to figure out what they're going to put in the cart, that's where you end up, seeing it showing up versus actually paying the retailer. So I think in many ways, these retailers are really going to fight for dollars from an Instacart, even though they're partners, right? I think there's going to be this complicated, situation there. And I think if you are a, brand, then you have to figure out exactly, how is the consumer ultimately going to know about you?
You write in Undaunted that when I speak with entrepreneurs and would-be entrepreneurs, they often ask me, how do I know when to launch my product? How perfect does it have to be? And the answer is perfect enough to deliver on the basic product promise. It's now been 15 years, Kara, and as we head into the final stage of our conversation with would-be Kara Goldin's taking notes, what was the basic product promise for Hint, and how has it endured through different stages of your company's growth?
So the basic promise was always to create water that tasted better without sweeteners and without preservatives. And, we've always done that. But we've continued to, have a better label. We originally had clear labels. Then we figured out that things like in Whole Foods or, which was our first store, that we couldn't control the lighting that was on the shelf. So when we were kind of bookended by products that had bright labels or other clear labels, you just couldn't see our product at all. So, my advice really to entrepreneurs is get your product out there, figure out what your consumer promise is, and you can always continue to get better on your packaging, on, your marketing materials. But at the end of the day, let the consumer, get your product and taste your product. And if you're a food product, and obviously it's got to be safe, but, we went from, those early days of maybe having a shelf life of 30 days to now 2 years with no preservatives. I mean, that's the other crazy, thing that, again, I don't typically talk about it. I talk about it a bit, in the book, but we just didn't know that nobody had done a non-alcoholic beverage, a water beverage that had real fruit in it that didn't have preservatives. To us, we were just consumers, we were just asking the questions. And I think that's what was so fascinating even to the bottlers when we were going to them. We'd ask them questions like, okay, we want to not use preservatives. And these bottlers would be like, oh, we don't want to like touch that because we don't want, a lawsuit. And then we would, start to, like, there were plenty of people who just hung up the phone at that point and said, we're not even like interested in having this conversation. Those same people, once we actually figured it out, are coming back to us and saying, like, you've created an industry standard for so many companies that not only are you using less ingredients, but you're actually like thinking about it, and you've helped our companies to innovate. So I think it's something that we personally don't get a lot of credit for. But if you talk to a lot of bottlers out there, they'd say, yeah, there was this product hint and we never ran it actually, but then we ultimately, ended up using what they were doing.
Cara, eventually to scale, you needed investors. One of them was Ken Sadowski, a legend from the industry, and then comes Verlinvest. How did you figure out who you wanted and could take money from?
Yeah, so both of those guys are awesome. I mean, they've been really supportive of really how we've been growing the company, particularly recently, as really people have kind of understood what hint was and wanting to really bring more and more health into their life. But Ken was actually, his grandfather was a distributor and one of our original distributors. And so that's how we met Ken. And then Ken actually introduced us to Verlinvest. They had been not on their board, but advisors at Vitamin Water. And Ken was also on the board of Vitamin Water. And so he knew Verlinvest was basically, most of the money came from the Stella beer family in Belgium. And so he knew that they wanted to make investments in non-alcoholic products. So that was really, when they jumped in and both of them, jumped in. And it's interesting. I mean, they've definitely, invested in the company. I think what's most interesting about our company and sort of the way that we've been able to kind of raise capital is we have over 100 investors. We don't have private equity or venture money, especially for a Silicon Valley brand. We have a lot of female investors that have invested. We have a lot of fans, including John Legend. Also just people who have kind of grown up in tech, who have really been drinking our brand. Maybe the brand solved a problem for them that they were trying to solve, and reached out to us over the years and said, hey, if you guys are ever doing a round of financing, I literally get those emails weekly, still to this day, where people they're like, I just love the brand and I really want to work, I really want to invest if there's a way. And so when that's happened, we've, reached out to these people and said, yeah, we're doing a round if you're interested. And I mean, it's amazing how fast those deals get done, because you're not trying to, convince somebody, right? Like they're already hooked on it. And many of those people also are asking us to take the company public too. And, that's something that we've entertained as well.
I follow your Twitter feed at Cara Goldin. I see the joy that you have in visiting places like Bentonville, Arkansas, as you chronicled in a recent Wall Street Journal story. But as you are grounded, like so many of us, and sitting at home with Theo, Emma, Caitlin, Keenan, and Justin, and also Sadie and Buster during the pandemic, what do you prize most about the journey that Hint has taken the Goldin family on?
Oh, so much. I mean, I think just, as a female leader, teaching, my then 4 kids under the age of 6 who are now 3 in college and 1 in high school, that you can actually do something that maybe seems, daunting, right? Like that they also, in a time when there are very few female CEOs, there are very few founders that actually remain the CEO. And 15 years later. And so I think, my kids are very alert and aware, and they know that they've grown up in a house where, their parents work together, during a time when we're clearly having that conversation throughout the U.S. and in Silicon Valley, that's just not the way that things work. We have over 60% of our employees are female as well. Like we just do things just a little bit differently. And so I'm hopeful that I'm, and most proud that I'm teaching, my family and maybe some of their friends that it doesn't have to be that way. That you can actually go and do what you're passionate about and go try and kind of tackle hard things. And, you'll learn a lot along the way. And I feel in some ways too, that we started this company to really, help myself and help my family and help consumers. But now I feel like we're in a place where we've developed a few other products, including sunscreen and deodorant, and now just came out with hand sanitizer as well. If we can lead companies to do the right thing and not put ingredients and, a bunch of crap in their products that consumers shouldn't be having because it's unhealthy, like that's a pretty awesome, to lead, lead companies to do better. I mean, that's amazing.
And that is amazing, Kara. And we are so grateful for the time that you've given us to give you a hint of what was in your past, what's in your present, and what may still hold in your future. It's been great to have you inside the Ice House.
Thank you so much.
And that's our conversation for this week. Our guest was Kara Goldin, the CEO of Hint and author of Undaunted, Overcoming Doubts and Doubters. If you like what you heard, please rate us on iTunes so other folks know where to find us. And if you've got a comment or a question you'd like one of our experts to tackle on a future show, email us at icehouse@theice.com or tweet at us at IceHousePodcast. Our show is produced by Pete Ash and Kearney Ferguson with production assistance from Ken Abel and Ian Wolfe. I'm Josh King, your host, signing off from the library of the New York Stock Exchange and heading online for an e-commerce break to order myself another case of Hint. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week.
Information contained in this podcast was obtained in part from publicly available sources and not independently verified. Neither ICE nor its affiliates make any representations or warranties, express or implied, as to the accuracy or completeness of the information and do not sponsor, approve, or endorse any of the content herein, all of which is presented solely for informational and educational purposes. Nothing herein constitutes an offer to sell, a solicitation of an offer to buy any security, or a recommendation of any security or trading practice. Some portions of the preceding conversation may have been edited for the purpose of length or clarity.